From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NOCO, your daily slice of Northern Colorado news and happenings. It's Tuesday, May 14th. I'm Erin O'Toole. Access to a great education and finding a way to pay for it. That was a common thread running through some of the most notable bills that Colorado lawmakers introduced at the state capitol in recent months. The 2024 legislative session wrapped up last week with lots of new laws on the books, including one that offers 2 years of free community college to some state residents, and another designed to make sure rural K-12 schools are funded properly. KUNC State House reporter Lucas Brady Woods followed these proposals and dozens of others. Lucas, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, Lucas, I want to start with one of the most notable new laws to come out of the session, and that is one that helps Colorado students attend college for free, 2 years at a community college, to be precise. Tell us more about what this law aims to do.
As you said, education and access to education was a huge focus for lawmakers this year, including the cost of higher education and community college. So what this law, or soon-to-be law, aims to do is for families who make under $90,000 a year, it will provide 2 years of community college for free.
Well, let's talk about property taxes now. They are, of course, a key piece of funding schools in Colorado. And property taxes have increased sharply in recent years, right along with home values. Tell us how lawmakers tried to ease the pain of surging property taxes without cutting school funding.
So this has been a long time coming, this property tax deal. It's been a problem, like you said, for a couple of years. Last year, lawmakers really tried to cram a property tax solution through on a partisan basis, and voters ended up rejecting that at the ballot box in November. So this year they really came together to form more compromises. And a lot of these, tough questions that they were trying to answer are around the education funding piece of this, because schools and local school districts are primarily funded by property tax revenue here in Colorado. So they couldn't just cut taxes, right? Because that would cut funding for schools. So they had to find a way to lower tax rates, and then they had to find money to backfill that for the schools. And they came up with a pretty creative solution, and that's they're not actually backfilling schools with state funding. What they did for the school funding element is people will actually pay a lower rate for most of their property taxes, but they'll pay a separate, slightly higher rate for property taxes specifically for their school district. So it will lower taxes for, other local government revenue, lowering sort of the rate at which people are taxed on their properties. But that rate will be slightly higher for the schools. But for the school districts themselves, they're keeping that rate higher than the rest of the property taxes.
So, Lucas, another of the most talked about bills was about reforming the way K-12 schools are funded. This formula, it's worth noting, has not been updated in 30 years, and the new law is designed to help rural K-12 schools in particular. Tell us about that.
This is a big deal, and some lawmakers have been working on this for a decade. And this is a formula that really changes the focus and where the funding itself goes, right? So instead of the current system that's been around since the early 90s, this would direct funds to not only rural schools, but also schools that serve high populations of students in poverty, English language learners, and unhoused students, and students with special education needs. So it really directs the money to the most in-need populations, which includes rural schools. And I think that element, the link with rural schools and other at-risk student groups, really was able to bring a bipartisan coalition together on this that included the top Republican in the Senate, top Democrats in the House, and really pushed this through. So as Republican House Minority Leader Paul Lundeen said, this is making it about the students.
I want to talk about one bill that ultimately failed, and that would have addressed police misconduct. It would have required officers to report any misconduct they witnessed by other officers or face a misdemeanor charge themselves. What happened with that measure?
That got voted down on the House floor after it got through its first committee hearing. And this was a pretty fraught bill. Like you said, it's about internal police misconduct, and former and current officers from a few different departments across the state brought this bill, and many of them are victims themselves of sexual assault, harassment, hazing, this kind of thing within their departments. And a lot of these individuals have been sidelined completely from the law enforcement industry because they came forward. So this bill was aiming to fight retaliation against officers that come forward. So whistleblower protections and accountability for officers that don't report misconduct. And this bill, from what I hear, was really, faced a lot of pushback from the brass, law enforcement brass, the higher ups, the chiefs. Mm-hmm. They pulled their weight at the Capitol and really lobbied hard against this. Eventually, it just didn't have the votes.
So, Lucas, do you think we'll see another police misconduct bill maybe in the next session?
I do. The former and current law enforcement officers that brought the bill have told me that they plan to bring it back next year, and they're committed to continuing this effort.
Pulling back for just a moment, the tone in politics can get really ugly these days. Last year's session revealed a lot of tension between Democrats and Republicans at the Capitol. This year, it was a sort of a mix of collegial and nasty. Lucas, what stands out to you about the tone this session?
The biggest thing that stands out to me is the stark contrast from the end of this year's session to the end of last year's session. There was so much tension and so much animosity that was boiling over, not just between the parties, but within the Democratic majority. There was some real clashes there between progressive members of the party and the party establishment and the party leadership. This year could not have been more different. There were literally lawmakers dancing on the House floor, Republicans and Democrats together, doing the Macarena on the last day. And,
wow.
I think that is because the last days of the session were not just collegial, they were celebratory. And I think some of these big grand compromises, like we mentioned over property taxes and education and others, really fostered a collegial atmosphere and ended it on a tone that could not have been more different than last year.
Covering politics is intense, and it sounds like this year was certainly no exception. How do you unwind now that the session is over?
Mostly take off my suit, to be honest with you. You have to wear a suit every day at the State House because of the dress code on the floor. And honestly, I'm happy to not put on my tie for the next, until next year's legislative session, unless I have to. There are elections coming up that I will have to wear my tie at certain things. But for the most part, I'm happy not to wear my suit and tie.
Lucas Brady Woods covers the state capitol for KUNC. Thank you so much for covering what's happening and keeping us posted. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
If you like this show, we want to hear from you. We want to know what questions our listeners have about Colorado laws or politics or something else entirely. Send us your burning questions, Colorado, and we might look into them. Write to NOCO@KUNC.org. That's NOCO@KUNC.org. That's it for us today here on In the NOCO. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.